this whole idea that the world has given over to animalistic populists is just a lie.
Hello, this is Stephen Edgington for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Lionel Shriver. Lionel Shriver is an author and a commentator. She wrote the famous book, We Need to Talk About Kevin. In this interview, we're going to be talking all about the pandemic, 2021, issues of free speech and culture. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Stephen. I've enjoyed a lot of your other interviews on YouTube, so I feel honored to join a considerable list of people who've talked to you.
Well, 2021 will be a fantastic year to talk about. Maybe not a fantastic year in itself. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of a lockdown. Boris Johnson says this lockdown, we've got a massive vaccination program. This lockdown will be ending in the next few months. Do you believe him? And do you think that, this lockdown or parts of this lockdown will last forever?
I mean, economically, it's absolutely impossible for it to last forever without digging a hole in the Atlantic Ocean and dropping the entire island in. I mean, this is ridiculous. I do worry that there's going to be a hangover, especially in relation to civil liberties, because we just rolled over. I mean, we just abdicated virtually every civil liberty that a year ago we took for granted that no one could remove from us. And once someone has done something to you once, they can do it again. All of these civil liberties are now provisional. They are conditional on public health, if nothing else. And I'm afraid public health, I wrote a column about this a while back. Public health has been the thin end of the wedge on infringing on civil liberties for quite some time. All these measures are brought in for our own good. And how can you object to that, really? So, the confiscatory taxes on cigarettes, the burdensome taxes on petrol, the new taxes on sugary, fizzy drinks, they're all, to make us better people, to make us live longer and in better health. But there is virtually no limit to which these incursions on our ability to make our own decisions about our own lives will stop. There's everything you do could conceivably be construed as having something to do with your health. And this is made especially easy in the situation where we have a National Health Service. Your health is now everyone else's business. It's not just your business.
Well, this last point is an interesting one, because I'm sure that Boris Johnson would argue, and I've seen a lot of libertarians, or let's call them self-describing libertarians who support the lockdown, would say, well, the issues that you talked about there, the sin taxes on cigarettes and things like that they shouldn't happen because they affect you and they only affect you. Whereas with this pandemic, for example, the actions that you take by going outside and socializing and interacting with other people could have real harm on others, could lead to eventually other people catching the disease, other people being hospitalized, and other people dying. So that would be their argument, that your actions need to be regulated because it's not just about your health, but it's about other people's health that you could be impacting.
I would like people to assume responsibility for the amount of risk they want to put themselves at. And that's not irresponsible. So that means that if you are very fearful, perhaps quite rationally, of this virus, you are in a category of who that you might die, then act accordingly and make decisions accordingly. Don't go to the supermarket, send somebody else. Always get your food delivered. Don't leave the house. none of us are required to go out there and put ourselves at risk with other people. So if you don't want to go to a pub, for example, nobody's forcing you to go to a pub. If you think they're too dangerous, nobody's forcing you to go out to eat in a restaurant. Stay home, make your own dinner, fine. And you won't get any criticism from the likes of me. I just don't think that the government should be telling you that you have to stay home and make your own dinner.
Well, this is also an interesting point, because if you look at opinion polls, a vast majority of people support these lockdown measures, including people who are, everyone's being immensely impacted by this, but, for example, people who may have lost their job or on furlough, or their business is having to be closed down. Many of those people are even supporting the lockdown. So perhaps some people find it strange that the government decided, well, we need to enforce this by law. And as you say, it's kind of up to people to take risk in their own lives, to take their own responsibility. And if most people believe in the lockdown measures already, why do you need the police to go out and fine people for going for a walk?
Well, I have found the wholesale public embrace of lockdown as an approach to this disease completely bizarre, and I can't say that I entirely understand it. It surprises me. It surprises me about the British. It just surprises me about many Americans. We have never responded to contagious disease in this manner in history, much less all at once, all over the world, especially all over the Western world. This is unprecedented. The disease is not unprecedented. We've had diseases before. We have a word for pandemic for a reason. They occur with some regularity, and they're one of the risks we run as animals, right? But we've never closed down the better part of our societies in response to them. How did everyone buy into this at once? I mean, it's one big copycatting incident. And even more bizarrely, the country we copycatted was China, and I would say that's pretty near the bottom of the list of the countries that I would want to imitate in relation to anything. And I think there's an element of people not wanting responsibility for their own lives and their own decisions. It's relaxing to have that taken from you. I think that for a lot of people, the experience of lockdown has not been unpleasant. It removes all kinds of decisions from you, and decisions they require energy, and they entail the possibility of making the wrong one. So and even in relation to socializing and hanging out with your extended family, about whom many people are ambivalent, to say the best. I think that there's a segment of the population that is discovering they're rather glad to get out of it. You know what? Because other people are a lot of trouble. They take a lot of energy. They have their own needs and their own stupid opinions. Isn't everything simpler when you just don't see anybody? In fact, life is very simple right now, and there's something in me that kind of likes it too. I will confess. I pretty much don't have to do anything aside from going out to get food for myself on rare occasion. I've rarely had less required of me, and that's easeful, right? So I think there's something in everyone that is loving this, and it lets us off the hook for everything that's a lot of bother. I think it's ultimately soul destroying, and I recognize in my own life that it's gradually eroding friendships that I have invested many years in cultivating. And Zoom and doesn't cut it. Most friendships don't thrive in that way. Some of us got in touch with each other at the beginning in that manner, but we've pretty much given it up. A little email, but that gets too dry and abandoned. And so, we just don't communicate anymore. And that's a kind of loss that, well, it's unquantifiable and irreplaceable.
Can I put a couple of defenses to people's reactions to the lockdown? Because I think that there is, there's obviously a lot of irrational and rational thinking going on here. And you make the great point of how lockdowns impact individuals. Now, maybe you and I, relatively healthy, relatively young people can sort of ride the wave, and it's a bit depressing. I'm not able to see friends and things like that. But as you say, in some ways life becomes more simple. But for example, my grandparents who've sort of been together for 60 years haven't been able to see each other for over, I don't know, over a year or something, because one of them's in a care home and one of them is having to isolate themselves at home. So it's impacted them in, I can't believe how much it's impacted them in terms of not only their physical health, but their mental health. So the lockdown really does impact people in different ways. But I know so many people who support the lockdown and family members, friends, people like that.
I do too. Yeah.
And I think that the main reason isn't out of some kind, maybe it is subconsciously, but I suspect it isn't some kind of laziness or sort of wanting to remove responsibility from their lives. But I think there is a genuine fear, because 100,000 people have died. The media every single day, with these press conferences and the new reports about how many, the deaths and everything like that, this does cause a lot of angst and a lot of, and people probably know people who've died, family members, friends. It's a lot of people, 100,000. That you can quibble over the numbers, but you have to admit that is a very big number. And then on the second point I want to make about sort of the idea that you were surprised that so many people supported this so quickly. Do you not think that humanity is a kind of herd animal? And once everyone's supporting it, then it's not really a surprise, because most people are quite willing to sort of sign up to that agenda. So when the government are telling them that this virus is so deadly, and let's be honest, it has killed a lot of people, and then that merging that with this kind of pack mentality, perhaps it isn't so surprising that so many people support this thing.
Well, yes. I mean, that's been the big lesson for me throughout this, is human susceptibility to conformity. And I would also say susceptibility to mania, which we also saw with the BLM protests. I mean, that was a kind of insanity, because that one killing by a policeman in Midwestern United States just didn't have to do with the rest of the world. It was irrational. You had marches in South Korea where they don't have any Black people. What are they talking about? And it was itself a kind of contagion. I think we're seeing, I mean, this is what I'm especially interested in right now. We've been seeing repeated incidents of a kind of ideological contagion. Me Too was the same thing, suddenly erupting all over the world. And, it clearly has something to do with our digital interconnectedness. There's always been a kind of contagiousness to ideas that will cross borders, but they seem to explode now much more rapidly and be embraced in an almost perfectly universal manner all over the world in astonishing short order. And the embrace of lockdown as an approach to a pandemic is a very good example. So, I wouldn't want to malign people who support this approach to COVID-19. I think that most people who embrace lockdown are well-meaning. They want to do their social part. They wish their compatriots well. They believe their leaders, and they believe that their leaders are well-intentioned and are doing their best and are making decisions on their behalf. I mean, I accept all that, but what if your leaders are wrong? I mean, we are better off if we're all still functioning as independent thinkers. We all have access to the internet, or virtually all of us, which means that we're capable of doing our own homework and our own research, which is, you know, one of the things that I have been doing ever since this disease came along. And there is a lot of information out there to suggest that lockdowns are doing vastly more harm than they are good. There is no correlation between the stringency of government policy and what happens with the disease. I mean, and there have been, I mean, I've lost count. Last I heard, 23 major peer-reviewed studies verifying exactly that they don't work. So if they don't work and they cause infinite numbers of harms, and you know, our time is limited together, so I'm not going to go on and on about what those are. Obviously, huge economic damage, and that's not just rich people not making so much money. It's obviously people who've built small businesses for decades being completely devastated. All the cancers that we're missing, we're going to be paying the health consequences for a lockdown for a lot longer than we pay the health consequences for COVID-19. So, you know, all the depression, all the increase in suicide, the devastation of our children's education, you know, I could go on. But even in terms of actual deaths accrued, it is very likely we're going to lose more people to the lockdowns than to COVID-19. Now, you know, I accept that, you know, maybe I'm wrong. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe all those studies are wrong. Maybe lockdowns work a treat. Although, if so, I would really like to know why we're still in our third one. I mean, doesn't that demonstrate it doesn't work? And what we can anticipate is that this spring, this is a seasonal virus, obviously, so it comes up in the winter. It will subside in the spring in the same way that it did last April, and the government's going to take credit. And in fact, it will just be a natural process. So, you know, I have my eye on that. I think it's one of the reasons that I have continued to write about this and to plug what's become a minority view that some people actually think is evil and socially irresponsible, is that I am very anxious about this approach to disease being installed permanently as just what we do. You know, this will be the new protocol. This country and no country can afford to repeatedly shut down for months on end, pile up mind-blowing public debt, and expect to thrive. That is suicidal. And if we had another pandemic anytime soon, and I mean anytime within decades from now, and we do it again, it's a catastrophe. So, you know, one of the things that we're going to have to do is look at, once this is finally over, and we're all starting to wonder when that's going to be. I want a hard look taken at what the efficacy of this approach was and what the cost benefit was. I mean, the government never did any cost benefit analysis when it went into this the least we can do is look back at it and be honest with ourselves, what we have done to ourselves and what we got out of it.
This last point about the sort of finality of lockdowns is one I want to explore a bit further. But before we do that, and I don't want to quibble too much about the kind of science behind lockdowns and things, I think that's maybe getting a bit too much into the weeds. But I'd love to talk a bit more about a broader sense of how this is going to change our society. But first of all, I would just say, obviously, the government would claim that lockdowns do work, that they managed to bring down virus cases before. They would claim that we're having to have a new lockdown because there's a new strain of coronavirus that's more contagious. Lots of government scientists say lockdowns work. We're seeing infections come down over the last week or so. So they would claim that's what they would say in sort of response to your arguments.
Sure. Yeah. And by the way, I hate to be boring, but correlation is not causation, right? So yes, this is what the government has done from the beginning. When the cases come down, when infections, deaths come down, the government takes credit. It all had to do with government policy. And when they go up, it's because we're not following the rules. It's never because of policy. So I'm sorry, that's a little too convenient. And I as I said, I am anticipating that this spring. That's what's going to happen.
Well, I would just say to people watching this video, it's worth looking at the statistics in Sweden, who had a very similar, sort of curve to us, despite the fact they had very different lockdown measures. But also, balancing that out, their government has now sort of gone for a much harder stance on the lockdown because I think, they're seeing a lot more deaths. But anyway, I read this fantastic, and I really want you to comment on this fantastic article in the Telegraph by Alistair Heath today. And he was saying that in 1914, before 1914, the world was progressing. You had globalization, you had huge amounts of progress, whether it's economically or scientifically or whatever, and you saw huge amounts of travel and trade and people getting higher living standards. And then there was this awful war. There was World War I, and following that, it took a very long time. And he said it took a century for the world to recover in terms of globalization. Countries turned in on themselves. They believed in autarky and protectionism. And it was a kind of turning point, I suppose, in not only the way that the world interacted economically, but also socially, and attitudes obviously changed hugely. Now, he's saying that this pandemic is perhaps something similar. For the last 30 years, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've seen huge amounts of globalization. Obviously, there hasn't necessarily been massive amounts of economic growth, at least in the West, but in China and other places like that, we've seen huge amounts of economic growth. But we have seen the rise of the internet and technology, and there's been huge changes in our lives. And he's saying, his argument is that COVID-19, this pandemic, is a new turning point for protectionism. We've seen that with this row with the UK and the EU in terms of vaccine supply, these vaccine wars. He says it's an argument for sort of ending globalization. We've seen countries immediately shut their borders. It's now, you are now not allowed to leave the United Kingdom for a holiday. You have to have some kind of legitimate excuse that the government approves beforehand. So do you agree with him? Do you think this is a kind of turning point in the way that our civilization and society is set up?
I think it could be. The longer this goes on, the more likely that it is a major turning point. And I find the whole thing with the borders especially forbidding. The idea that you actually can't leave the country. I mean, that's like being behind the Iron Curtain. That's what it was like in Eastern Europe. You couldn't get out. The government told you whether or not you could leave, and you could get out only in very, very discrete circumstances with official permission. And that's the situation we're in now. If anybody has thought about the logic of this protecting against new variants of COVID-19, you should be very, very disturbed, because viruses mutate. They always do. This virus has become endemic all over the world. There are many more variants out there that we don't even know about because they're in countries that don't do genomic research, right? So nobody's keeping track of what's happening to the virus there. If we close our borders to anyone coming in because we're afraid of variants with an endemic virus, an endemic means it's not going anywhere. There is no zero COVID future. This is a virus that is joining the family of diseases that we have to live with. That means we close our borders forever. Now, if that doesn't scare the out of you, I don't know what would. Look at, here we are starting to imitate New Zealand and Australia. New Zealand and Australia have put themselves in a situation they can't get out of, especially with this new variant fear. So the vaccine, that one of which might be, able to evade the available vaccines, there's no way out. The New Zealand and Australia have walled themselves off from the rest of the world, and they're just going to have to stay there. Either that, or finally get to the point where, okay, well, we've done that, and now we're going to risk living in the rest of the world with everyone else where there are coronaviruses, and they will come into our country, and we're going to resign ourselves. And there will be variants and all that. But until that reversal, and that's a long way off, if ever, those are brigadoons. They have ceased to be a part of the international world. And I don't want that to happen to the UK. And I just don't think that the UK can functionally do that. But that's a disaster on many different levels. Logistical is one of them, but also just in terms of what kind of life do you want to live? We are potentially looking at an indefinite future where there's no more air travel. And that depresses me more than I can say. Certainly, if we carry on for very much longer, telling people they can't go anywhere, they're just not going to be any airlines left. I mean, these companies cannot exist indefinitely. I don't know whether you've been on an airplane anytime recently, but for the most part, there's hardly anyone on them. Those flights are flying at a loss.
Let's talk about some other major events of the last 4 or 5 years. And perhaps the pandemic has been accelerating certain sort of attitudes within the population. But, obviously I'm talking about Brexit. I'm talking about the election of Donald Trump. You could even say, and you mentioned earlier, the George Floyd protests, the rise of the woke movement, the rise of the anti-woke movement. And that obviously includes you and some other commentators and authors, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, people like that. Huge debates online over the last 4 or 5 years, huge political revolutions. Where do you see these ending up? Where do you see these going in 2021 and beyond? Do you think that the people are still sort of in revolt against establishment ideas and institutions?
Well, if we're going to look at the United States, the establishment is firmly back in control. And of course, that's a vague concept. But, the weird thing about the Trump era is that the left still controlled most of the levers of power in the US. It just didn't control the federal government. And of course, it didn't like that. In fact, the left went bananas under Trump. But it's not paranoid, but I think quite accurate to assert that broadly the left controls the media, the mainstream media. I mean, there is Fox, even Fox is in a weird place because they got caught between Trump on the one hand and not wanting to lie about the election on the other. I feel sorry for them. But Fox is an anomaly. So all the major newspapers are basically left wing, with the exception of the Wall Street Journal. These are generalizations, so there are exceptions like the Journal. And the left completely controls universities. That's been widely documented. That's also not paranoid. And I don't consider myself right wing anyway, so it wouldn't be paranoia on my part. I share some of the views of, at least of the conventional classical liberal left. But this whole idea that the world has given over to animalistic populists, the undereducated horde who are seething with racism and misogyny, it's just a lie. I mean, the aberration was Trump. And I go on record, always worth doing. Was not a Trump supporter, never was. Glad to see the back of the guy, although I fear we haven't really. But I don't see in Western society that that's really where we're going. I am much more concerned about the autocratic impulses of the left, and and also the left's susceptibility to fashionable ideas of the moment that are actually destructive and yet somehow are successfully imposed on institutions across the country. Like this whole critical race theory nonsense. It's everywhere. You've got Joe Biden, who's 78 years old, and so it's not his generation, parroting this business about the problem with structural racism in the United States. I mean, that's, the left has managed to impose a perspective and a language. I really object to the language on American institutions with shocking success. And it's a kind of tyranny. And again, some of these people are also well-intentioned, in the same way that people who support lockdown. I do accept that there is a segment of people who really embrace these ideas, and they believe that if these ideas are instituted and acted on, that there will be a fairer world and a better world. I happen to disagree. I think the left has done more damage to race relations in the last 10 years than any white supremacist movement, which, by the way, real white supremacists in the United States are like, they wouldn't fill a football stadium. So I'm much more afraid of the left right now than I am afraid of a lot of right-wing populists. And, I did my last column for the Spectator about the Capitol riots and, pulling back from them. And they're the best thing that ever happened to the Democratic Party, right? I mean, they're bannered on CNN every night. They're all over the New York Times practically every day. And that, those are the supposed populist rabble that we're supposed to be so afraid of. Oh, great, and horns and furry hats and no shirt. And, they didn't look that scary to me. It was an ugly, ugly incident. And I would never defend it. but I didn't think that it was the face of a whole new movement in the US. These are the animals who have to be controlled. I mean, they're a minority. They're a little nuts, but I don't think that this is the big war that we're looking at in future in the United States.
Well, war is a very topical word, I think, at the moment, especially in the Biden administration. Now, if you do tune into CNN, if you did tune into Biden's inauguration speech, and if you do listen to what people like Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, Adam Schiff, the kind of language that they're using at the moment about these, what you do, not obviously what you would describe as, but what they would describe as sort of populist rabble, or at least that mob that described that sort of took over the Capitol building. They're using words like domestic terrorism, white supremacy, a 9/11 style commission to fix their domestic terrorism laws. Does this kind of language further radicalize people? And, obviously you said there you're afraid of the authoritarian left. Where, can you be specific about this? Where do you think that this leads to? And I'm just going to give a bit more preamble before you answer that, because they like to talk about these very vague ideas of the phrases that I've used there: white supremacy, domestic terrorism. We live in an institutionally racist or systemically racist society. And yet I sometimes feel a bit confused, and hopefully you can enlighten me about what their solutions are and what they want to do to tackle these, in their view, disastrous problems.
I think that's an excellent question, and I don't have an easy answer. I don't share these ideas, so of course I can't tell you from my own perspective what kind of wonderful future awaits and all the different things that are going to happen because of the embrace of these ideas. I see only more rules, more fear, more alienation between groups of people. So, I can't answer that for you. Now, for example, I don't know why turning the United States into a great big confessional where it's mostly directed at white people. White people confess their sins. They admit to everyone in a very public way that they now realize they're racist. They were born racist. They've always been racist. I mean, that Robin DiAngelo book instructs white people to become less white, which, you know what? I wouldn't know how to do that. I mean, if I really concentrate, I just can't get less white. I don't see why this is productive, honestly. If people really believe this and aren't doing it as a cynical display, which of course a lot of people are, then what good does it do anybody? Most importantly, what good does it do members of minorities? How are Black people better off if I put on a hair shirt and weep and apologize? In fact, in terms of just dealing with each other on a day-to-day basis, this stuff is terribly destructive. I mean, I've noticed that, and again, I'm thinking the United States right now. When you deal with someone of another race, it's a little more tense than it used to be. Everyone's a little more self-conscious, especially the white party. And there's a certain kind of behavior you get from white people right now when, they're dealing with somebody socially or even in a commercial situation who's, say, Black. The anxiety is through the roof. And there's a kind of overperformance of friendliness and niceness and warmth in a way that is unnatural and downright creepy, And if I were on the receiving end of that gushing goodness and fake enthusiasm and uh, fraudulent warmth, it would turn my stomach, you know. And this is the kind of thing that I care about in some ways as much as, the more ideological stuff. I think that these ideas are starting to infect our ability to be a unified country. If we're going to get on, Biden's lingo, he's very big on unity. Well, these are some of the most divisive ideas ever to come along. And, what's happening in the United States and in the West in general, it's not just Trump. It's not just Brexit. It is being fed by a poisonous ideology which has spread like wildfire. And, I don't know what the answer is. You've asked how I see the future. I keep wondering when some of this stuff is going to peak and subside, and it just gets worse. I never thought that we'd have the U.S. Congress declaring that they can't use gendered nouns anymore and refer to anyone as a woman or as someone's sister or someone's mother. I mean, what kind of insanity is this? So I keep waiting, and instead of everyone getting a grip and kind of coming down from their high of self-righteousness and regaining a sense of humor, I just see everything getting worse. And the only thing that I hold out hope for is not the likes of my generation, but maybe an upcoming generation, who's tired of it, or who begins to perceive all this critical race theory stuff and the obsession with identity as the older generation, and that's their bag, that's their parents' bag, and so they don't get on board with it. And I guess that's what I'm waiting for, and I may wait a long time, because as far as I can tell, because this stuff got started in the 90s, it's already skipped at least 2 generations. It's infected more than 1 generation.
It's funny, you keep predicting my questions, but this last point you make is a fantastic one, and I like to ask some optimistic questions. I know sometimes these issues, talking about these issues can get quite depressing. I think that so far this conversation has been pretty downbeat, to say the least. But let's add a bit of sort of optimistic. I'll add a sort of optimistic note to that. This is from anecdotal point of view. So it's not that useful, but I would say, I'm only 21. I know a lot of young people. And I think, a lot of people that I know, including people on the left, are sick of this stuff and do think it's ridiculous. But sometimes perhaps they're not vocal about it because of, fear of speaking out. Because if you do say something, against these kind of thoughts, then you get slaughtered for it on social media. So I suspect there are a lot more people out there who do think this stuff is crazy than most people might initially think. And the other point to make about this, we've gone so far away from the ideas of Martin Luther King, which is fascinating how we sort of, as you say, moved away from the idea that everyone in a very basic sense is equal, no matter what your skin color is, and we should treat people on an equal basis. And a huge part of that is teaching children at school the history of the civil rights movement and these fundamental ideas, and not just the history, but also the philosophy and sort of how these fundamental ideas of how the Enlightenment has happened and all these things. I think there's a great opportunity there for children to learn this stuff, and perhaps they're not being taught it in schools, but the internet, Now, this has been the big revolution over the last 10, 20, 30 years. The internet has enabled people to make their own mind up about these issues. And it's certainly the reason that I'm sitting here doing this interview, is because as I was growing up as a teenager, I was watching YouTube videos, I was reading stuff on the internet from alternative voices. I wasn't getting it from my school teachers. And I think many, many people are doing that. So are you hopeful about the realm of the internet? And we'll get on to censorship in a minute. But for now, are you hopeful about this kind of revolutionized way that we consume information?
Well, I mean, the internet has been a great resource for me in my work. When we were talking earlier about the pandemic, uh, that's one of the things I was encouraging people to do, is do a little homework on the internet. We now have access to an astonishing amount of information if we just go looking for it. Um, and I think we need to be a little more proactive about going to look for things instead of just looking at stuff that's fed to us, because the tool permits that. We can ask Google anything. I would say, on the level of being optimistic, that so-called young people are often given a bad name, especially by people like me, somewhat older and censorious about censoriousness, if you will. And it's not fair. And I meet an occasional real live young person, and they're not homogeneous. They don't all have these same views. Some of them are quite sensible, and not only are some of them quite sensible, but some of them are quite brave and willing to go against the tide and stick their necks out, and other tired metaphors. There was an interesting personal essay on the Persuasion. I get their newsletter. It's supposed to be a kind of classical liberal site. And it was by an actual young person. And she was trying to explain to an older readership that why it is that it seems as if, all these university students have the same orthodox opinions. She says they don't. In fact, that it's a very small percentage of the student body, but they're loud and they get the attention of the administration. Everyone else, and it's like, okay, so here's 95% of the student body. Most of them are just keeping their heads down. They're paying a lot of money for a degree. They want to get out of university with that degree, and they want to be able to get a job with it, and they don't want any trouble. Now, that's not exactly brave, but it's pretty rational, and it doesn't mean, that silence does not mean complicity. And I would enlarge that to a larger silence. You get these extreme ideas parroted in the media all over the place, to the point where it's now controversial to claim that there is such a thing as sex. Most people are not susceptible to these ideas. Most normal people in both, and I'll speak for the UK and the US, they're fairly sensible. They don't just glom on to the latest, most extreme, and most fashionable idea. They do think there are such a thing as male and female. They don't necessarily believe that their societies are endemically and systemically and irretrievably racist. It's important to remember that. I mean, this shrill autocracy on the left is, as much as anything, the product of institutional cowardice. It's what are often called the elite, meaning people in positions of authority in institutions, who want to look good, amongst each other, and are not necessarily acting in the best interests of the institution, or much less the larger society. But the regular people, they don't say anything. They often don't have a forum for saying anything, aside from maybe on social media, which is also often completely overtaken by all these shrill left-wing voices. I think we should at least celebrate the fact that, you know, there is still a majority that doesn't buy into this stuff. And that's the majority of young people. In fact, it's the majority of people of all ages.
Let's talk about some of the cultural institutions that we vaguely referenced throughout the interview that are perhaps pushing these identity politics ideas and the kind of woke agenda. For example, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, social media, sites, big tech companies, Silicon Valley, they have been at the forefront this year of censoring huge amounts of people, including the former president of the United States, who no longer has a Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Spotify, Discord. The list goes on, endless list. Pinterest. None of these sites will have him. They shut down a whole social media site called Parler, which claimed to be this sort of hub of free speech. And the reasons that they gave for this was that, for example, they said with Donald Trump that he was inciting violence. They said with Parler that they didn't regulate their comments enough. Apple, for example, said that their sort of, their moderation policy wasn't strict enough for Apple to have them on their platform. And they basically claimed that by allowing these people to be on their platforms, that two things were happening. First of all, violence was being incited, was being accelerated by these platforms and by these people. And second of all, extremism was being pushed by these people. Now, what do you make of those two arguments, those two reasons? Can either of those reasons ever be used as a justification for shutting down a voice, for example? What do you make of those excuses?
Well, the one limitation on freedom of speech that I do wholeheartedly embrace is incitement to violence. So when big tech censorship is going specifically for people who are posting in a way that is demonstrably trying to stir people up to physically injure people. By the way, I'm very strict on the word violence. I like the dictionary definition. It doesn't have anything to do with words. It has to do with hurting property or people physically. So anyone who's trying to encourage that, I think, should be shut up. Okay. But as a matter of fact, Donald Trump's tweets were taken down, not because of incitement to violence, but because of so-called glorification of violence. And that's a little weirder and has no limits. I mean, if I talk about how great it was that we defeated the Axis powers in World War II, well, that's glorification of violence, isn't it? So that's taking that incitement remit too far already. Now, in general, I was initially of two minds when Trump's account was deleted on Twitter, because I'd seen enough of those postings, and just on a partisan level, I was happy to have him shut up. And I didn't like the dissemination of this notion that he had actually won the election after all. But I had a secondary response, and it didn't take very long. And that was finding it quite chilling. Yeah, I don't like the guy. And of course, that means I want him shut up. But I don't think I should be allowed to shut him up. I don't think Twitter should be allowed to shut him up. And I know that we're in a very funny place in terms of what the rules are. Technically, these tech companies are private, and then they're supposed to be able to control what is and is not said on their platforms and who gets to participate in them. It's their business. But we all know that they've become so big and such a public forum that that's a little disingenuous. I don't quite know what the legal what the legal answer is. That's not my bailiwick. But I am very anxious about the new acceptance of the role of grand censor, big brother, by these, Facebook, Twitter, etc. I think they're all of a piece when it comes to their political outlook. Silicon Valley has a very narrow view of the world, and I don't want them to be able to impose it on everyone. One of the things that makes me anxious about Biden's so-called war on terror as it applies to his own country on American soil is that I think that what we're going to see as a consequence is much fiercer censorship of what are perceived to be right-wing sites, and emphasis on perceived to be, because that's all that matters. It doesn't matter what you really are or what you really say. If you get a reputation for being right-wing or white supremacist, then you're going to be out of there. And I'm afraid that these people are going to be shut up and kept off the internet. And that's a kind of permanent half-life. And I'll tell you, if there's anything that could be radicalizing, that's it. If you're dealing with people who are dissatisfied, who've just lost the election, maybe some of them do think that it was stolen from them, even if they don't have evidence, that doesn't matter. That's what they think. And then, you've got a situation in the US right now that the left controls absolutely everything, everything, including the entire federal government. These are people who are going to feel very disempowered, disenfranchised. The world is against them. And if you stop letting them use words, then you're asking for them to use other implements. And I think that is dangerous. One of the reasons I'm an advocate of free speech is that speech is ultimately harmless, right? I mean, that's not a popular view anymore. We think that words are terribly dangerous. And yet I made it clear I have that limit as far as I'm concerned on incitement to violence. But aside from that, words don't bite. And in fact, if you give people an opportunity to get something out of their system just with words, then you're lucky and nothing terrible has really happened. So we're all consumed with the hatred on the internet. Well, you know what? Just don't look at it, because it doesn't actually physically hurt anyone. And you're better off for them just spew nonsense. Well, let them then act on it in another way. So I think that the internet has been an important kind of safety valve for people to spout off about things that they feel. Let them. It's not actually hurting anybody.
Your first reaction to Donald Trump being banned, this is someone I don't like, and it feels good that he's now gone away. I think that's probably one of the major reasons, if not the reason, that censorship exists, is because that is the first human reaction to someone that you don't like, or someone who's saying things that you don't like. So I think that's first of all, that's an interesting point, and you explained it so fantastically as to why people support censorship. The second point is about this other platform, Parler. Now, I find this fascinating how they said when people say we're against censorship, tech companies would say, well, look, we can publish what we want on our own platforms. You can set up your own platform and you can go on there and you can talk on there. But when this company tried to do that, they were prevented from doing that because Amazon and a whole series of other companies who supported Parler shut them down and shut down this service. Now, you said that when people are not allowed to speak, you implied that that then leads to violence. Do you think that there is any possibility that this all ends up in a very violent way, whether it's in a year, in a few months, 2 years? Do you see that happening?
Well, that's always possible. I'm reluctant to predict it. You know, it's funny, journalists and commentators are often pressed to predict the future, and it's the one thing they can't do. So I have no way of knowing that. But I do believe that suppression creates resentment and fury. I've experienced direct censorship in that platform way we're talking only once, but it was quite sobering. The Spectator sometimes asks me to read aloud one of my columns, and it gets posted on YouTube. And this summer, YouTube took it down because it violated community guidelines, right? And they never explain. But it was a column about COVID-19. It was actually about this business of what might be some explanation for why minorities are suffering higher infection and death rates. All the factual information in that piece was taken from the New York Times, which was reporting on a study done by Columbia University. So, you know, how mainstream can you get? What do they want? It was really mystifying. What I was left assuming is that there was something about what that study meant they didn't like. Now that is sobering, because what it demonstrated, and you can see how this would make some people quite queasy, is that once you remove obesity as a confound from the figures, there is no statistically significant difference in death and hospitalization rates. That's awkward, but that's what the study demonstrated. It's the fact that YouTube didn't like, not the information. The information itself is what YouTube didn't like. So that's not fake news. And there, you know, that whole, but I'm not particularly fussed about Hunter Biden and his computer. I never thought there was that much to that story, but it was still, you know, it was still a factual story that was censored by big tech because they didn't like it, not because it wasn't true, but they didn't like the truth. That's the beginning of the end.
I want to tie my final question. I want to tie all these parts together in this interview and finish with this. We talked about the pandemic and lockdowns and how people were so willing and are still willing to give up their fundamental freedoms in their life to, for example, protect the NHS or protect the public, or the public health. That would be their sort of justification. And then we talked about censorship and big tech censorship. And it was Angela Merkel, of all people, to come out and defend Donald Trump when he was banned from Twitter. Now, obviously, Angela Merkel, I think it's pretty obvious to anyone with eyes, can see that she pretty much detests Donald Trump. But it was her who defended his right to say what he wanted to say. It wasn't people in America. It wasn't the land of the free, as they like to be described. And, you know, Britain, for example, you've got such strong connections with both the UK and America, so you're in a perfect place to answer this question. You know, they're completely different countries, but Britain has a fantastic 1,000-year history we like to boast about of democracy and freedom and parliament and Magna Carta. And someone like Boris Johnson, for example, big libertarian, he would defend Britain as a home of the free. And America was, you know, it was made on the same ideas. And it's even more in the American psyche to defend this idea of liberty and freedom. And yet, we've given two examples, the lockdowns and big tech censorship, and we haven't seen too much retaliation against either of those things. Are we living a lie? Are our societies completely built up on very fragile ideas that don't really have real life impacts?
I think in both countries there has been an enormous erosion of belief in the importance of freedom of speech. And that starts to extend to every other freedom, doesn't it? One of the things that we have abdicated in the UK is the right to protest, including, you know, the right to protest against not being able to protest, right? On the speech issue, I think increasingly on a collective societal level, we have lost the belief that you should be able to say bad things. I think that we think that you shouldn't be able to say bad things. And if you say bad things, you should be arrested. That's what all this hate crime stuff is, hate speech crime. And of course, what is a bad thing is the question then, right? So very easily, what counts as a bad thing, the category gets bigger and bigger, and what you're allowed to say gets less and less. But that narrowing is made possible by making the concession at the start that there are just certain things you shouldn't be able to say because they're ugly and they're hurtful, they cause harm. This whole idea that words are violence. You know, that just means the unraveling of any pretense to liberty. And now, you know, the lockdowns have introduced an abdication of liberty in every other sense, in a very physical sense, not just in an ideological one. And I find it really forbidding. In both countries, I think that we are drifting toward a more authoritarian attitude, and we're starting to embrace a more cynical view of humanity, that people have to be controlled, that we are no longer interested in having a society where people are very different and have very different attitudes and very different opinions, sometimes violently opposed. We want to have a society where everyone behaves themselves and has the same good opinions and says all the same good things. And we're going to decide what those good things are. And they'll do all the same good things because we've decided it's good for their health. It's a very totalitarian mindset, and it clearly creeps in by degrees. But I don't see any way in which we are pulling back from it. And someone like me, I can make an effort. We can have this conversation, but it's very hard to affect this larger drift that, and that, you know, liberalism used to be about celebrating difference, about letting people loose to be individuals and to make their own decisions about their lives. And liberals used to embrace the free exchange of ideas, and that's just all over. So, you know, I'm sorry, because I'm again drifting toward that depressing, dark texture that too much of this interview has had, but maybe that's the effect lockdown has had on me.
Thank you very much, Lionel. I would suggest go and read a book and things, and enjoy life. Don't spend too much time on the internet. It will depress you. But thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you.